The Council enforced a 900-year exclusion on humanity. One border violation changed the situation overnight. The document was filed under Galactic Administrative Code 7 Theta 9, subsection 44. It ran to 11,000 pages in its original Keth dialect, and the translated human version, produced by the Allied Xenolinguistics Bureau in 2041, came to roughly 19,000. Most of humanity never read it. Most of humanity never needed to. The summary was simple enough. You are quarantined. Do not attempt contact. The exclusion is for your protection and ours. The Interstellar Council, a governing body comprising 41 recognized spacefaring civilizations, had issued the exclusion decree against humanity in the year 1143 CE, though humanity at that point had no idea such a council existed, let alone that it had voted, unanimously, to seal off the entire Sol system from interstellar transit. No explanations were offered. No ambassadors were dispatched. Humanity simply found itself inside a bubble it could not see, enforced by a civilization so far ahead technologically that the enforcement cost them nothing. For 900 years, that bubble held. The first solid confirmation that the exclusion zone existed came in 2031, when the Pathfinder 4 Deep Space Survey drone, operating at the outer edge of the Oort cloud, encountered something that shouldn't have been there. It was not a wall in the physical sense. It was a drift suppression field, a quantum boundary that made faster-than-light passage through that region of space computationally impossible. Sensors registered it as a kind of silence. A hard stop. The drone's navigation AI, running on experimental protocols, flagged the event as non-natural spatial resistance, and transmitted the data back to Earth. The message took 11 hours to arrive. It was decoded in 40 minutes. The team at ESA's Deep Navigation Center in Toulouse went very quiet. By the time the data had been verified and cross-referenced against the theoretical work of Dr. Priya Anand at the Mumbai Institute for Astrophysics, 3 governments already knew. The Americans, the Indian coalition, and the combined European authority each received the same classified briefing within a 72-hour window. The Chinese Space Administration received theirs 4 hours later, a delay that would later become a diplomatic footnote. The briefing contained one conclusion: humanity was enclosed. There was no panic. That surprised many people later. But the individuals in those rooms were not politicians in the tabloid sense. They were strategic analysts, engineers, and scientists who had spent careers thinking in decades and light years. They understood the data. They sat with it and they thought. The question they kept returning to was not why are they keeping us in, though that mattered enormously. The question was, what kind of civilization enforces a 900-year-old decree without ever updating it? That question would define the next decade of human foreign policy, even before humanity had any formal foreign policy to speak of. The Council, for its part, was not watching closely. They had not been watching closely for a long time. The exclusion zone was automated, monitored by relay stations positioned at 12 equidistant points around the heliopause. The stations reported anomalies. They logged drift attempts. They had been logging zero activity from Sol 3 for so long that the Council's Administrative Office for Class F civilizations deemed pre-contact, had moved humanity's file to a low-priority archive tier in 2019. Nobody had flagged it for review. The first records of direct human encounters with extraterrestrial intelligence had been quietly classified by multiple governments beginning in the 1980s. The Council was aware of these incidents. They had in fact staged several of them, probing events designed to assess cognitive and social development. The assessments were filed. The conclusion each time was the same: not yet. What the Council had not accounted for was velocity. Human development from 1950 to 2040 had not been linear. It had been exponential in the truest mathematical sense. Computational power, materials science, propulsion physics, quantum communication. All of it had accelerated in ways that even the Council's predictive models, calibrated for species that developed along slower social timelines, had failed to anticipate. The relay stations around the heliopause were still running the same monitoring software from their last update cycle in 2003. They were not designed to detect the kind of activity humanity was now capable of. Which is why, when the Vosmeridian, humanity's first crewed long-range exploration vessel, crossed the heliopause boundary on March 14, 2043, the Council did not immediately know. It took 6 days. The Vosmeridian was not a warship. It was a 340-meter deep space research platform, crewed by a multinational team of 22 scientists and pilots, operating under the joint authority of the Earth Cooperative Space Agency. Its mission parameters were classified at the highest level: but its ostensible purpose was heliopause mapping and interstellar medium sampling. Its actual purpose was to see what happened when it crossed the line. Commander Yara Salas of the ECSA had been selected for the mission not because she was the best pilot, though she was very good, but because she had the right psychology. She was calm under ambiguity. She did not escalate situations she didn't understand. She was methodical, not impulsive. The selection panel had reviewed 300 candidates and come back to her name 7 times. When the ship passed the boundary, nothing dramatic happened. The drift suppression field registered the transit and logged it. Alarms did not sound. The boundary was not designed to stop, only to discourage. The assumption had always been that humanity lacked the technology to even reach it. That assumption was now 9 years out of date. Salas noted the crossing in her mission log with the same tone she might use to record a course correction. Boundary transit confirmed at 4:17 ship time. No anomalies. Proceeding on current heading. 6 days later they picked up the signal. It was not a weapon lock. It was not a distress call. It was a bureaucratic notification, an automated response from one of the Council relay stations, transmitted in 43 languages, none of which were English, Mandarin, Hindi, or any other human tongue. The Voss Meridian's communication AI spent 11 hours working through the signal structure before producing a rough translation. The message said, "You have entered a restricted transit zone. This area is under Interstellar Council administrative authority. Please identify your vessel and species of origin and await further instruction." Salas read the translation twice. She looked at her communications officer, Dr. Kenji Wada, who had the particular expression of a man holding a very large piece of information very carefully. She said, "Log the transmission. Send our identifier package. And get me a secure channel to Earth." Then she went to her cabin and wrote, by hand, in the small notebook she always kept with her, "We were not supposed to be here. We came anyway. I don't think anyone on that council expected us to have the manners to knock." Back on Earth, in 6 days' time, 300 million people would learn that humanity had just sent its first formal response to an alien civilization. The governments that had authorized the mission had prepared statements, protocols, legal frameworks, and contingency plans for every likely scenario. They had not prepared for silence. The Council did not respond for 19 days. What happened inside the Council chambers during those 19 days would not become known to humanity for another 3 years. But when it did, when the full record of that emergency session was finally translated and released, it became one of the most studied documents in the brief history of human-alien relations. Because the record showed something no one had quite expected. The Council was not angry. Was afraid. The 19 days of silence that followed humanity's first formal alien contact transmission were not, as many assumed at the time, a sign of indifference. The Interstellar Council was not slow. 41 civilizations, many of them operating on communication timelines spanning star systems, had developed administrative processes that would make even the most patient human bureaucrat feel underprepared. But 19 days was fast by their standards. Emergency fast. The kind of speed that meant something had disrupted normal procedure. The Council's emergency session began within 48 hours of the relay station's automated report reaching the administrative hub at Varith Station, a deep space installation orbiting a brown dwarf 14.7 light-years from Sol. The session was convened under Article 9 of the Council Charter, the article reserved for unforeseen contact events involving quarantine civilizations. In 900 years, Article 9 had been invoked twice. The first time was in 2301 CE, by Council reckoning, when a quarantine species in the Cygnus arm had independently developed ensemble equivalent communications and accidentally breached the communication barrier before achieving spaceflight. That situation had been managed through careful signal dampening and a quiet, prolonged first contact process that took 60 years to complete. The second time was now. The session was chaired by Ambassador Tesek of the Velhari, the oldest member species of the Council and the civilization most directly responsible for drafting the original Sol Exclusion Decree in the 12th century. Tesek was, by human reckoning, approximately 400 years old. The Velhari lived long lives and accumulated institutional memory the way geological strata accumulated history, slowly, densely, and in layers that required significant effort to read. Tesek had read humanity's file personally. All 11,000 pages of it. The record of the session shows that Tesek opened with a statement that surprised many of the younger member civilizations in attendance. The translation reads, "We should not assume that the crossing was accidental. We should not assume it was aggressive. We should instead ask what kind of species, after 900 years of sealed isolation, develops the technology to breach the barrier and then, upon doing so, sends a politely worded identification packet and waits for a response. That framing shaped the entire 19 days. The Kreth delegation, representing a civilization that had been among the most vocal advocates for the original exclusion, argued for resealing the barrier. Their position was grounded in the original Council risk assessment from 1143 CE. Humanity had shown, in the centuries prior to the exclusion decree, a pattern of resource exploitation, interspecies warfare, and territorial expansion that fit the profile of what Council xenosociologists classified as a Type C emergent risk. A civilization capable of rapid, destabilizing expansion if introduced to interstellar space prematurely. The Kreth were not wrong to cite that history. The assessment had been accurate at the time it was made. The question was whether it remained accurate now. This was the central argument of the Solhari delegation, a species that had themselves been under a short-term quarantine 2,000 years prior, before their admission to the Council. Ambassador Solhari Den made the case methodically, citing the surveillance data the Council had collected on human development over the past 4 centuries. The data was more extensive than most humans would have been comfortable knowing about. The Council had never been entirely passive during the exclusion period. Observation had continued. Probes operating under stealth protocols had maintained monitoring of Earth's electromagnetic signature, cultural evolution, and technological trajectory. The data showed something that the Kreth assessment had not predicted: convergence. Human civilization had not simply grown more powerful. It had grown more coordinated. The wars of the 20th century, which the Council had monitored with something close to alarm, had given way to slow, fractured, imperfect but genuine cooperation. The Earth Cooperative Space Agency itself was evidence of that, a genuine multinational body with actual authority, not a political facade. The Vast Meridian had been crewed by citizens of 11 different nations. Its mission had been authorized by a committee representing 60% of Earth's population. That was not the behavior of a civilization that intended to invade. The debate ran for 16 days. What finally shifted the balance was not an argument from any ambassador. It was a second transmission from the Vast Meridian. On the 11th day of the Council session, Commander Salas had sent a follow-up message. It was brief. The translation into Council standard had been included in her original identifier package, which meant her AI had spent the preceding days working through the relay station's language matrix. The translation was imperfect but legible. The message said, "We understand this crossing may have caused concern. We are not here to make demands or establish claims. We are here because we wanted to know what was out here. We are prepared to wait as long as necessary for guidance. We have supplies for another 4 months. We would appreciate knowing, at minimum, whether we have caused harm by being here." The Council chamber went quiet when that was read aloud. It was, several ambassadors later noted in their personal records, a remarkably human thing to say. Not in the sense of being uniquely Earth-originated, but in the sense of being exactly what you would say if you had been raised on a single world, isolated for your entire civilizational history, and had just, for the first time, reached across the dark and knocked on someone else's door. The final vote on whether to initiate formal contact was 38-3. The 3 dissenting votes were from the Kreth and 2 allied civilizations who remained unconvinced that humanity's cooperation signals were culturally stable rather than situationally performative. Their objection was recorded, noted, and filed under Article 9, Clause 7. Dissent registered but overruled on grounds of observable behavioral evidence. The response to Commander Salas was composed collaboratively, reviewed 7 times, and transmitted on day 19. It was 7 words in Council standard, translated into 11 human languages simultaneously. Sol 3. We receive you. Stand by. Salas read it on the ship's bridge, surrounded by her crew, in a silence that had the particular quality of a room full of people trying very hard not to cry. She recorded her response in the ship's log. First formal acknowledgement received. 19-day lag. No hostile action. Behavioral assessment. They are deliberate, not hostile. This is going to take a long time. I think that's appropriate. What neither she nor anyone on Earth yet knew was that the Council's decision to respond had triggered a secondary process, one that had not been used in over 1,000 years. The formal review of the Sol Exclusion Decree. Under Council law, any quarantine civilization that independently achieved heliopause transit and subsequently demonstrated non-aggressive contact behavior was entitled to a full reassessment hearing. The hearing was not automatic. It required a petition. But the Council, in a procedural move that surprised even its own legal staff, filed the petition internally on humanity's behalf. The hearing was scheduled for 8 months from the date of first contact. Humanity had 8 months to prepare for the most important conversation in its history. No one on Earth knew the hearing was coming. The first public announcement came on April 3, 2043, 20 days after the Vos Meridian's boundary crossing, 11 days after the Council's response, and approximately 16 hours after the three governments with full situational awareness, the American Federation, the Indian Coalition, and the Combined European Authority, reached the reluctant conclusion that continued secrecy was both strategically unwise and ethically indefensible. The broadcast was carried simultaneously on every major state and independent network across Earth. It lasted 14 minutes. It was delivered not by a head of state but by Director Amara Osei of the Earth Cooperative Space Agency, a choice that had been deliberated for 48 hours and ultimately reflected a consensus that this was, at its core, a scientific and exploratory achievement before it was a political one. Osei was 53 years old, a Ghanaian astrophysicist who had spent 20 years at ECSA working on deep space propulsion systems before her appointment to the directorship. She was not a charismatic speaker in the conventional sense. She spoke carefully and precisely, choosing words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. She did not reach for grandiosity. She did not invoke destiny or historical inevitability. She stated the facts in order with appropriate caveats. On March 14 of this year, the ECSA research vessel Vos Meridian crossed the heliopause boundary at a point in the outer Oort cloud and encountered a structured spatial anomaly consistent with an artificial field installation. On March 20, the vessel received a transmission in an unrecognized language from a source consistent with an orbital station. Our communications team has been working since that date to analyze and translate this signal. On March 29, we transmitted a response. On April 1, we received acknowledgement. She paused. There is an interstellar governing body. It has known about us for a very long time. It has, until now, chosen to maintain our isolation. They have responded to our presence not with hostility but with a request to stand by. We are doing so. We will share all information as it becomes available. The broadcast ended. The world did not end with it, which surprised some of the more anxious members of the Disclosure Planning Committee who had spent 3 weeks wargaming public reaction scenarios. There was no mass panic. There was no collapse of financial markets. There was volatility, a sharp but brief correction, followed by a recovery within 48 hours as analysts absorbed the fact that humanity had, apparently, handled an alien contact event without anyone getting shot at. There was something else instead. Something harder to quantify but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. People went outside and looked up. Not in fear. In something closer to recognition. As if the sky had always been that populated and they were only now remembering it. The diplomatic crisis, when it came, did not come from aliens. It came from inside ECSA's own governance structure. 12 member states, including Brazil, Nigeria, Russia, and the Southeast Asian Coalition, filed formal objections to the fact that the crossing mission had been authorized without full council consultation, citing the ECSA Charter's requirement for unanimous consent on missions beyond the heliopause. The objection was technically valid. The authorization had been granted by a 57% majority vote of the Security Committee, on the legal grounds that the heliopause boundary was a natural astronomical feature and not a recognized territorial limit. That legal argument was considerably thinner now that it was confirmed the boundary was, in fact, an artificial installation maintained by a governing body that humanity had just acknowledged as real. Director Osei spent 3 weeks in Brussels managing the internal diplomatic fallout before any external alien policy work was possible. The irony was noted by several commentators. Humanity's first alien contact event had, at least in its early weeks, primarily generated conflict among humans. But the work was progressing in parallel. ECSA's linguistics team, working with academic partners at 17 universities and 3 national intelligence agencies, had made significant progress with the Council standard language captured from the relay station transmissions. By mid-May, they had a working vocabulary of approximately 4,000 terms and a partial grammatical model. It was enough to have rudimentary conversations, provided both parties were patient. The Vos Meridian had been resupplied by a second vessel in late April and was now operating as a forward communication post. Its crew expanded to 31 with the addition of 8 linguists, 2 xenosociologists, and a legal theorist specializing in non-human institutional frameworks. The legal theorist was Dr. Arjun Mehta of the Delhi School of Interstellar Law, a discipline that had existed for 20 years primarily as an academic exercise, debating hypothetical frameworks for alien diplomacy, and had never expected to be called into actual practice during any of its founders' lifetimes. Meta arrived on the Voss Meridian on May 12, 2043, read the Council Transmission Archive in 48 hours, and submitted a 70-page preliminary assessment to ECSA within the week. His conclusion, which became the foundational document of human-alien policy going forward, was direct. Humanity is not being granted contact. It is being evaluated for contact. There is a difference. The Council's language is procedural, not diplomatic. They are running a process. We need to understand that process before we attempt to influence it. Our best advantage at this moment is the one we have already demonstrated, that we are capable of patience and restraint. We should continue to demonstrate exactly that. The second Council transmission arrived on June 7, 2043. It was longer than the first, substantially longer. When fully translated, it ran to 412 sentences across 3 distinct formal registers, suggesting it had been composed by a committee rather than an individual author. The transmission informed humanity of several things simultaneously. First, that the exclusion decree had been placed under formal review. Second, that the review process would require humanity to submit documentation on its governance structures, resource management practices, and military capabilities. Third, that a preliminary hearing was scheduled, in their time reckoning, approximately 8 of Earth's months from the date of the transmission. The fourth item in the transmission was the one that nobody expected. The Council was sending an observer. A single representative from a species that had not been named in the transmission but was described as an intermediary civilization familiar with the developmental trajectory of Sol 3, would arrive at the heliopause boundary in approximately 60 days. They were coming to Earth. Or rather, they were coming close enough to Earth that someone from Earth would need to go and meet them. Meta read the transmission in the Voss Meridian's briefing room, surrounded by people who had spent the last 3 months becoming the foremost human experts on alien communication, and he said the thing everyone was thinking. We need to decide who goes. And we need to decide what they're going to say. And we have 60 days to do it. The alien vessel resolved on long-range sensors at 4:22 ship time on August 19, 2043. It was 340 kilometers out when the Voss Meridian's passive detection array first logged it as a discrete contact. Not because it had just arrived at that distance, but because it had only at that point chosen to stop masking its presence. The vessel was 2.1 kilometers in length. Its hull composition did not match any catalog material in ECSA's database. It was not a warship in any recognizable configuration. There were no weapons emplacements visible to the sensor suite, no hardened defensive geometry. It looked, to the astrophysicists running the initial scans, like a very large, very old, very carefully maintained research vessel. Commander Salas noted in her log, "It's showing itself deliberately. They wanted us to have time to adjust before they were close. That's a choice someone made. Remember that." The crew of the Voss Meridian had prepared for this moment for 60 days. They had studied everything the translation team had produced on Council protocol. They had drilled communication procedures. They had decided, by consensus and with ECSA's approval, that the initial meeting would involve 3 people. Salas, Dr. Mehta, and Dr. Wada, the communications officer who had by this point spent more hours immersed in Council standard than anyone else alive. The alien vessel did not broadcast when it arrived. It waited. After 2 hours, Salas transmitted a greeting in Council standard, following the formal structure the linguists had modeled from the relay station archives. The transmission was brief. Vessel identification, crew composition, stated purpose of the meeting, and a request to establish communication at mutual convenience. The response came in 40 minutes. It was, by any measure, the strangest moment in human history up to that point. Not because of what was said, the words were almost mundanely procedural, but because of what it represented. A voice from another civilization, from a species with a biology and a history completely unlike humanity's, speaking in a language that had been designed specifically as a neutral medium between species that had nothing else in common. The observer identified itself as Counselor Mediator Seville of the Thari people. The Thari, subsequent research would reveal, were one of the founding member species of the Council, a civilization approximately 11,000 years old, whose world was a temperate ocean planet orbiting a K-type star 23 light-years from Sol. They were not the most powerful species in the Council. They were, by reputation, the most trusted, a distinction earned not through military might or economic scale but through 4,000 years of serving as neutral arbiters in contact disputes. Seville had been specifically selected to conduct this preliminary assessment because the Thari had been the civilization most directly responsible for maintaining the sole quarantine monitors since the 17th century CE. If anyone understood how to fairly evaluate the species that had just violated that quarantine, it was them. The initial meeting was conducted entirely by long-range transmission. No physical approach. No boarding. This was protocol. The Council's intermediary procedures required 3 stages of formal communication before any in-person contact was considered, a rule developed after a disastrous first contact incident 600 years prior in which well-intentioned immediate physical contact had triggered a defensive biological response that killed 2 ambassadors. The first stage was identification and intent. Salas handled this, with Wada managing the real-time translation support. It lasted 6 hours. The second stage was what the Council protocol described as contextual documentation exchange, both parties providing structured overviews of their civilization's current status. Humanity's documentation package had been prepared over the preceding 2 months. Governance structure, population and resource data, summary of technological capabilities, and a brief but careful accounting of Earth's major conflicts and their resolutions over the preceding 2 centuries. The decision about whether to include the history of Earth's wars had been debated fiercely at ECSA. Several member governments had argued for omission or softening. Meta had argued against this with considerable force. The Council has been watching us for 900 years. They have records. If we omit or misrepresent, we lose credibility on everything else we say. We present the history accurately, in context, with the trajectory of improvement clearly documented. We do not ask for forgiveness. We present it as data. Meta won the argument. Seville's response to the historical documentation came during the second day of the second stage exchange. It was not what anyone had expected. The Councilor Mediator said, "The Thari have reviewed the historical record provided. We note that the documentation includes conflict data that reflects poorly on Sol 3's developmental history. We note further that this data was provided without prompting, without omission, and without apparent attempt at favorable framing. This is consistent with the behavioral profile established by the boundary crossing event. Proceed to Stage 3. Stage 3 was a request for a single designated representative of humanity to approach within 1 kilometer of the Thari vessel for direct communication. Salas volunteered immediately. Meta noted, gently, that as the legal representative she might be more appropriate. Salas responded, with equal gentleness, that she was the mission commander and that this decision was operationally hers to make. She suited up alone. The shuttle she took was a 2-person craft stripped to bare essentials. No weapons, no secondary propulsion system. Both removed at Seville's request, which Salas had agreed to without hesitation. She flew it herself, manually, in a slow arc toward the Thari vessel, watching its surface grow from a metallic gleam into an immense, textured landscape of hull plating that had clearly been repaired and modified over the span of centuries. She stopped at 900 meters as instructed. The transmission channel opened immediately. Seville's voice came through, the actual voice, not a text relay, and Wada's translation followed in her earpiece with a 2-second lag. Commander Salas. We have reviewed the materials provided by your civilization. I am authorized to inform you that the preliminary assessment is positive. The formal hearing before the Council will proceed as scheduled. You will be permitted to send a delegation of up to 6 individuals to Vareth Station. Salas let the silence sit for 3 seconds before responding. Councillor Seville. We accept. Can you tell me, what was the deciding factor? In the assessment. There was a pause. Longer than translation lag could account for. You sent your history. The accurate version. Civilizations that are planning to deceive do not do that. Salas flew back to the Vos Meridian and spent 20 minutes alone in the shuttle bay before she came out. When she did, her face was composed and professional. She told the crew, "We're going to Vareth Station." The human delegation arrived at Vareth Station on December 14, 2043, after a 23-day transit aboard a Thari escort vessel, humanity's first experience traveling faster than light, courtesy of a borrowed drive system the Thari had calibrated specifically for the Vos Meridian's mass profile. The journey itself was almost anticlimactic in the physical sense. FTL transit, at least the Thari method, did not feel like anything in particular. The stars did not streak. There was no dramatic visual effect. There was a brief period of sensor blackout, and then there was a different star field outside the windows. What was not anticlimactic was the view when they came out of transit. Vareth Station was not a space station in the way humanity had previously imagined such things. It was not a wheel, not a cylinder, not a geometric shell. It was a structure that had grown over 4,000 years of continuous expansion and modification. A habitat complex the size of a small moon, irregular in shape, covered in what appeared to be a dense ecosystem of interconnected modules, docking structures, communication arrays, and what could only be described as architecture. Not functional architecture. Intentional architecture. The kind that meant someone had cared about how it looked over millennia, and had built beauty into it the way a city accumulates beauty over centuries. Salas stared at it for a long time from the observation deck. She wrote in her journal, 900 years ago, they decided we weren't ready. Looking at this, I understand why they were worried. I don't know if I agree with their conclusion, but I understand the fear. The delegation of 6 included Salas, Meta, Dr. Wada, xenobiologist Dr. Yuki Tanaka, included because several council species communicated in part through biochemical and physical signals that required biological interpretation, political scientist Dr. Ibrahim al-Rashid, and a translator-interpreter, Dr. Lena Voss, who was the daughter of the Voss Meridian's lead designer and had spent the last 8 months becoming the most fluent human speaker of council standard on Earth. They were given quarters on a Thari-managed transit section of the station, separate from the main council assembly areas. They had 3 days before the hearing. Meta used those 3 days with characteristic efficiency. He had requested access to the public record of the original 1143 Exclusion Decree deliberations, a request that had been unusual enough that it generated a note in Sievel's session log, and he had spent most of the transit reading the translated materials. By the time they docked, he had a 15-point analytical summary of the council's original reasoning and a clear understanding of which arguments had carried the most weight. The hearing itself was structured nothing like a human legal proceeding. There were no adversarial advocates. There was no prosecution. The council's process was closer to a review board than a trial, 41 delegations each with the right to submit questions, and a 7-member evaluation panel drawn from neutral member species, presided over by a rotating chair. The chair for the Sol 3 hearing was a Velhari, not Tesek, who had recused herself citing prior involvement with the original decree, but a younger representative named Envoy Reen, who had the patient, structured manner of someone accustomed to managing very long conversations between very different kinds of minds. Meta had advised the delegation to answer questions directly, without hedging, and to volunteer information rather than waiting to be asked. They will know if we are being evasive. They have been doing this for thousands of years. The first question, submitted by the Kreth delegation, was predictable. Sol 3 has a documented history of territorial conflict spanning 3,000 years of recorded history. What evidence can you provide that this pattern has changed in a structurally stable way, rather than representing a temporary period of relative peace? Meta answered. He had prepared for this question specifically. He cited the formation of the Earth Cooperative Space Agency, with its binding arbitration protocols and its actual enforcement record, 15 disputes resolved without military action in 20 years. He cited the drawdown of nuclear arsenals from a Cold War peak of over 60,000 warheads to a current stockpile of fewer than 900, under verified international treaty. He cited the coordinated global response to the climate stabilization crisis between 2025 and 2040, not a perfect response, but a functional one, producing measurable results on a planetary scale. Then he said something that had not been in his prepared remarks. I want to acknowledge the premise of your question. The pattern of conflict you describe is real. We are not claiming it is gone. We are claiming that its trajectory has changed, that the institutions we have built to manage it have demonstrated, over multiple generations, the capacity to function under pressure. That is not a guarantee of future behavior. It is the only evidence we can offer. We believe it is meaningful evidence. But we leave that judgment to you. The hearing room, which was not a room so much as a gravitational bowl of tiered platforms, populated by beings in a dozen different biological configurations, was quiet after that. The questions continued for 2 days. They covered military capability, resource extraction practices, population density relative to expansion capacity, cultural attitudes toward non-human intelligence, and the specific decision-making process behind the Voss Meridian's boundary crossing. On that last point, Salas spoke. She explained the mission design, the authorization process, and her own role as commander. She was asked directly, "Were you instructed to cross the boundary, or did you do so on your own initiative?" "I was authorized to cross if conditions were appropriate. The conditions were appropriate. I crossed. And if the response had been hostile? I would have retreated immediately and reported the contact. We were not there to fight. We were there to learn. The follow-up came from the Solhari delegation, delivered in a register that the translation matrix flagged as something close to warmth. That answer is consistent with the behavioral record. Thank you. The evaluation panel deliberated for 6 hours. The decision, when it came, was unanimous. The sole exclusion decree was formally suspended pending a 5-year probationary period, during which humanity would be permitted limited contact with council-designated civilizations under monitored protocols. Full membership review would be scheduled at the end of the probationary period, contingent on behavioral assessment. Seville, who attended as an observer, transmitted a brief personal note to Salas after the ruling. The last species admitted under this process required 4 hearings over 80 years. You required 1. The council will want to understand why. I suspect the answer is that you have been alone for a very long time, and you know what it costs. The 5-year probationary period began officially on January 1, 2044, in Earth Reckoning, a date chosen partly for administrative convenience and partly because the humans involved found it satisfying to begin this particular chapter at the start of a calendar year. What followed was nothing like the popular imagination of First Contact had predicted. There were no trade agreements signed in gleaming conference rooms. There were no dramatic species summits. There were no alien ambassadors walking through Times Square or Shanghai or Lagos for the cameras. The Council's probationary protocols were specifically designed to avoid spectacle, having learned from several previous contact events that spectacle created political pressure that tended to accelerate decisions past the pace that careful relationship building required. Instead, what humanity got was access. Structured, supervised, carefully calibrated access. The first provision of the probationary agreement was an exchange program. 4 human scientists, 2 astrophysicists, a materials engineer and a xenobiologist, would be permitted to work aboard a council research station for a period of 18 months. In exchange, a team of 3 council researchers from different member species would spend the same period at a facility on Earth. The selection of the Earth facility was its own diplomatic exercise. 47 nations submitted proposals. The site ultimately chosen was a newly constructed research complex in Namibia, built specifically for the purpose, set in 200 square kilometers of protected wilderness that offered the visiting researchers the kind of environmental variety that ECSA's xenobiological advisors had determined would be most useful for beings whose home worlds varied dramatically in climate and ecosystem type. The council researchers who arrived in March 2044 were 3 individuals who had volunteered specifically for the assignment. Their species were not publicly identified at their request, a provision that generated significant public frustration and significant diplomatic sensitivity, but which Meta had ultimately agreed to on the grounds that their safety and comfort had to be the primary consideration. What humanity did learn, gradually and through hundreds of small interactions, was the shape of the universe it had just been introduced to. The Council governed 37 inhabited systems directly and had formal relations with another 14 civilizations outside its membership. The oldest member civilization had been spacefaring for approximately 40,000 years. The youngest, before humanity's probationary status, had achieved contact 30 years prior. The Council's oldest records, maintained in an archival format that required specialized translation equipment to access, documented contact events dating back over 200,000 years. The scale of this, absorbed gradually over months of briefings and information exchanges, had a particular effect on the humans involved. It was not humbling in the way some had feared, the crushing recognition of irrelevance. It was, for most people who engaged with it seriously, energizing in a specific way, because the records also showed something else. Of the 41 member civilizations, 36 had at some point been under quarantine or probationary status. Of those, 22 had been quarantined specifically due to histories of aggressive expansion or interspecies conflict that raised concern about their fitness for interstellar participation. Humanity was not exceptional in having a violent history. It was not exceptional in having been isolated. It was not exceptional in having broken through. What the records showed was that the civilizations that had come through the probationary process most successfully were not the ones that had arrived with the cleanest histories. They were the ones that had arrived with the most honest self-assessments. Dr. Al-Rashid wrote about this in his widely read report to the Earth Cooperative Policy Council. The Council is not looking for perfect civilizations. There are none. It is looking for civilizations that have learned something from their imperfections, that have developed the institutional memory to recognize their failure modes and build structures around them. On that measure, we are more prepared than we may feel. The 4 humans at the Council Research Station were having a different kind of experience. Dr. Sione Tuilagi, the materials engineer from Samoa who had been selected partly for his expertise in exotic alloy fabrication and partly because his psychological profile scored extremely high on adaptability under novelty, spent the first 3 months essentially in a state of professional awe that he later described as trying to drink from a fire hose while the fire hose is also questioning your fundamental assumptions about thermodynamics. The technology gap was real and substantial. The Council's oldest member civilizations had been refining their understanding of physics for tens of thousands of years. There were areas of knowledge, particularly in quantum spatial manipulation, biological engineering, and energy generation, where the gap between human understanding and Council standard knowledge was not a generation or two but entire paradigms. The Council's researchers had expected the humans to be overwhelmed. What surprised them was the specific way the humans responded to being overwhelmed. They asked questions. Not performative questions, not political questions designed to manage the impression they were making. Specific, technical, follow-up questions that indicated genuine engagement with the material rather than surface-level processing. The Council researchers filed a joint note to Seville midway through the exchange period. The sole 3 individuals are learning faster than the intake rate we modeled for their developmental level. Recommend recalibrating assessment projections. Back on Earth, the probationary period was generating its own complications. The knowledge that humanity was under a 5-year evaluation had created political pressure of a particular kind, not the aggressive, expansionist pressure that the Kreth had feared, but a more interesting kind. A pressure toward coherence. Toward functioning as something more like a single civilization and less like a planet of competing nations that happened to share a space program. This was not comfortable for everyone. Sovereignty concerns were real and legitimate. The question of who spoke for humanity, formally, legally, in the context of interstellar diplomacy, had not been resolved when the Voss Meridian crossed the boundary, and it was not resolved now. ECSA had authority over the contact program but not over member state foreign policy. The Council had, politely but clearly, indicated that it preferred dealing with a coherent human diplomatic framework rather than 43 separate national positions. The political process this triggered was messy, slow, contentious, and ultimately productive. The Treaty of Nairobi, signed in March 2047, established the Earth Diplomatic Authority, a body with actual treaty-signing power on matters of interstellar relations, operating under ECSA oversight with proportional representation from member states. It was not a world government. It was not close to a world government. But it was a mechanism by which humanity could speak with something more like one voice when the situation required it. Seville, informed of the treaty by Voss during a regular communication exchange, transmitted a brief response. The Council notes the formation of the Earth Diplomatic Authority. This development is relevant to the probationary review. We will update the assessment record. It was, by the standards of interstellar diplomacy, a glowing endorsement. The 5-year probationary review hearing was scheduled for February 2049 at Varith Station. By that point, humanity had sent 41 individuals to various Council facilities, hosted 6 groups of Council researchers on Earth, established a permanent liaison office aboard a Thari-managed transit hub 3.4 light-years from Seoul, and graduated its first cohort of 32 humans formally certified in Council standard linguistic and diplomatic protocols. The world had changed in specific, observable ways. The Earth Diplomatic Authority had handled 14 formal interstellar communications, 3 of which had involved substantive policy discussions with Council member civilizations. The materials returned through the research exchange program had accelerated human progress in propulsion physics by an estimated 30 years. The xenobiological data from the Council researchers' time on Earth had generated 47 peer-reviewed publications and fundamentally revised the existing models for convergent evolution in planetary biospheres. But the most significant change was harder to quantify. The knowledge that humanity was not alone, that it had been watched, assessed, and found provisionally acceptable, had done something to the species that no political treaty or technological breakthrough quite captured. It had created, for the first time in any serious and broadly shared sense, the experience of looking at Earth from outside it. Not from space, which humans had been doing since 1961. From outside the assumption of isolation. From the recognition that humanity's choices were visible, that its history was on record, that other minds were drawing conclusions from what it did and how it treated itself and others. This was uncomfortable for some. For others, it was clarifying. Dr. Mehta, in his final policy memo before the review hearing, wrote, "The probationary period has done something I did not fully anticipate. It has given humanity a coherent audience for its better impulses. We have always had the capacity to cooperate, to reason, to build institutions that manage our worst tendencies. We have simply also always had the capacity to rationalize not doing so. Knowing that the Council is watching does not eliminate that rationalization capacity. But it has made it more expensive. That is, I think, sufficient. The delegation that traveled to Vareth Station for the review hearing was larger than the first, 14 people, including the original 6 plus 8 additional specialists in fields ranging from environmental governance to xenolegal theory to military doctrine. The military representative was General Adiz Okonkwo of the Earth Cooperative Defense Command, included at the Council's specific request. The Council, it turned out, was not naive about military capability. It did not require its member civilizations to disarm. It required them to demonstrate responsible command structures, clear rules of engagement, and verifiable accountability mechanisms. General Okonkwo had spent 6 months preparing a presentation on human military governance that was, by her own assessment, the most honest document the Earth Cooperative Defense Command had ever produced about its own limitations and accountability gaps. She had also prepared, at Meta's request, a brief on what humanity would expect from the Council in terms of mutual defense obligations if full membership was granted. This was a question that had not been discussed at the first hearing and that the Earth Diplomatic Authority had been quietly and carefully raising through back-channel communications for 2 years. The question was simple. If humanity became a member of the Council and was attacked, would the Council provide collective defense? The answer, as it turned out, was more complicated than a yes or no, and the process of working through that complication formed the backbone of the second hearing in a way that nobody had entirely anticipated. The review panel had been reconstituted with 4 new members, including one from the Kreth, a choice that surprised the human delegation and, they later learned, represented a gesture of procedural good faith from the Kreth delegation leader, who had argued internally that being part of the evaluation was preferable to being on record as having boycotted it. The behavioral review portion of the hearing took 6 hours and was, by the assessor's own characterization, straightforward. The 5-year record was clear. The human delegation had met every probationary condition. The Earth Diplomatic Authority demonstrated genuine authority. The research exchange program had been conducted with appropriate transparency. No militaristic activities had been conducted in restricted space. The complication came when General Okonkwo presented the defense doctrine question. The Council's existing collective defense protocols were calibrated for civilizations that had been members for centuries, had established diplomatic presence across multiple systems, and had military doctrines that had been peer-reviewed and refined through generations of Council oversight. Humanity was none of these things. What Okonkwo proposed was not immediate full integration into the mutual defense framework. She proposed a phased arrangement. Humanity would accept Council oversight of its deep space military operations, in exchange for which the Council would provide, not active defense, but early warning and intelligence sharing, for any credible threat to the Sol system identified through Council monitoring networks. It was a smaller ask than full collective defense. It was also, she argued, the appropriate ask for a new member. We are not asking you to trust us with your security. We are asking you to trust us enough to warn us if something is coming. We will handle the rest. The Velhari envoy Reen asked, and if you cannot handle it alone? Okonkwo answered without hesitation, then we will ask for help. Clearly, officially, and without embarrassment. That is what member civilizations do. The evaluation panel deliberated for 9 hours. When Envoy Reen returned to the chamber and the translation rendered in Vasa's earpiece, she reached out and gripped Salas's wrist without thinking. Salas covered Vasa's hand with her own and said nothing. The ruling was read in Council Standard first, then in 43 languages simultaneously. The Sol Exclusion Decree was formally and permanently dissolved. The Earth Cooperative Space Agency and the Earth Diplomatic Authority were recognized as the provisional governing bodies for humanity's interstellar relations. The Sol system was added to the Council's active membership registry, the 42nd entry in a record that stretched back 40,000 years. A full membership review, not a probationary one but a genuine peer review for full voting membership, was scheduled for 15 years hence. In the chamber, the humans sat with it for a moment. Then Meta leaned toward Salas and said quietly in Hindi, 900 years they kept us out. 6 years we spent getting back in. I keep thinking about what those numbers mean. Salas thought about the Vos Meridian in the dark, crossing a line no human had ever crossed, broadcasting a greeting into silence and waiting. She thought about Sievel's note, you have been alone for a very long time, and you know what it costs. She said, it means they were probably right to wait. and we were right not to wait any longer. The formal reception afterward was attended by representatives of 29 member civilizations, a turnout that, the Thari liaison quietly noted to Voss, was exceptional. Most first-member receptions drew 8 or 9 delegations. Nobody offered a toast. It was not a council tradition. But the sole Hari delegate, whose people had themselves come through quarantine 2,000 years prior, stood near Salas for a long moment and transmitted through the translation interface a single sentence. "Welcome to the long conversation. It has been waiting for you." Outside Vareth Station, in the vast and populated dark 41 civilizations and now one more continued the slow work of being neighbors across impossible distances, with patience that had been built over millennia and would need to last for millennia more. Humanity had not arrived as a conqueror. It had arrived as what it was, a species that had survived itself, learned from the survival, and decided that the universe was worth introducing itself to. That was enough. For now it was enough.